Prime Minister has said that in terms of this review, everything is on the table. Are we looking at a potential total overhaul of the system?
Well, it's easier said than done to have a total overhaul of the system, but where improvements can be made, then obviously I would recommend those. But the review itself is about what's called the Grocery Code of Conduct, and that sets out the relationship between the supermarkets and the suppliers of food, in particular to those supermarkets. Now, you've got consumers on the one hand who are feeling the pinch from a rising cost of living, and farmers on the other hand saying, well, they're not getting a fair price for their products. And we've seen this with meat in particular. Consumers saying, well, how come if there's a glut of lambs and other types of meat that prices are so high? So this review will focus particularly on that relationship between the farmers and wholesalers and the big supermarkets. But as you can tell from our conversation already, there'll be a much wider interest in the review because it's consumers in the end who really would feel the brunt of what's going on now, and hopefully get some relief if I can come up with some decent and very practical recommendations.
Yeah, I guess the obvious question from shoppers is, at the end of this, will we see lower prices on supermarket shelves?
Well, that actually involves a reduction in prices. That means disinflation rather than deflation. That's a little bit technical, but obviously as a former Consumer Affairs and Competition Policy Minister, I want to see more competition where we can achieve that, because competition does lead to lower prices. Market concentration tends to lead to higher prices. So there's a broader issue, Ruby, about the competitiveness of our market. We used to have really just Coles and Woolies. Now we've got Aldi. I helped facilitate the entry of Aldi around 2010. They were being kept out of the market effectively by state governments saying, well, you've got to go out to the warehousing area, and people didn't really want to go shopping in the warehousing areas. Anyway, they reduced their footprint. Now they're about 11% of the market. So there is some extra competition, but wherever there are ideas for extra competition, I think that's a good thing, because as I say, competition in the supermarket industry does mean lower prices.
The National Farmers Federation wants to see this code become compulsory. That seems like a pretty straightforward change that could make a big difference.
Well, let's have a good look at that. Yes, they are pointing to the fact that the Code of Conduct is voluntary. It was actually initiated by the supermarkets because there was a lot of heat on them. And, you know, I acknowledge that they said, well, let's have a Code of Conduct. It is actually enforceable, so it's not, you can just, you know, ignore it. But they could walk away from it if they wanted to. I think that would be a very bad move, and no one's suggesting that. But what you're getting at, and the AFF is saying, well, should we have a voluntary code of conduct or a mandatory code of conduct overseen by the competition watchdog, the ACCC? I think that's a very live question, but I won't today say that's a conclusion that I will reach as a result of this review. I'll follow the evidence, but that's certainly one of the possibilities.
And Dr. Emerson, I know you've just talked about some of your work in this space, but why are you well placed to lead this review?
I guess I've got a history as a competition policy minister, a minister for consumer affairs. I also was microeconomic and trade advisor to Prime Minister Bob Hawke, and I've got a PhD in economics in so-called microeconomics, which is, you know, right up my alley there for this sort of review. So I hope and expect that people will see that I do have the background to be able to come up with solutions that are actually workable, you know, that change the situation for the better. It's very easy for people to say, I'll give you an example. Why don't we just put a cap on the price of every supermarket product? Well, they tried that in the Soviet Union, and then people stopped producing those goods. So, and I know no one's seriously just suggesting that now, but there's a lot of ideas that seem appealing superficially, but we don't want them to be self-defeating. So they have to be ideas that actually work, can be put into place as actual policies to shift the dial in favour of consumers and the suppliers to the supermarkets.
And you've been announced today to lead this review, but I understand you've already been working on it behind the scenes for a while. Can you talk to us about the timeline for when we might see recommendations out of this?
Yeah, so look, I was approached not long before Christmas, so I've just been talking to Treasury officials who will form the team that works with me on the review. It is due to report by the 30th of June, so middle of the year. I think we'll probably require most, if not all of that time to produce a really rigorous report because, as I say, we want to actually shift the dial, not just say, well, look at me, I've got some really popular ideas that don't work. That would be a disappointment to everyone and I won't let that happen.